How did the United States become one of the most prosperous nations in human history? And at what cost? To answer that, it is necessary to start long before the birth of the United States, on the Atlantic coast of Africa in the mid-15th century. In 1441, Portuguese mariners sailing under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator pushed farther down the West African shoreline than any of their European predecessors, driven by a mix of curiosity, profit, and religious zeal. They did not simply trade cloth and metal for gold and spices. They seized human beings, carrying a small group of captured Africans back to Portugal as trophies and proof that people, not just products, could be extracted from this new frontier. What began as a handful of captives quickly hardened into a system. Within just a few decades, hundreds of Africans each year were being dragged across the sea into Portugal alone, as the opportunistic raids of early voyagers evolved into regularized trafficking routes. Fortified trading posts rose along the African coast. Local middlemen were drawn into the commerce of human bodies, and a grim new market emerged in which black lives were priced, insured, and recorded in ledgers. By the 16th century, other European powers had joined the trade. Spanish, French, English, and Dutch merchants crowded into the Atlantic, feeding the labor demands of sugar plantations on Atlantic islands and then across the Caribbean and the Americas. Over roughly 4 centuries, this transatlantic system ripped an estimated 10 to 12.5 million Africans from their homes and forced them onto ships bound for the New World, a scale of violence and displacement that permanently reshaped populations on both sides of the ocean. Only after this machinery was well established did the territory that would become the United States enter the story. In 1619, when 20-and-odd Africans arrived at Point Comfort in Virginia, the transatlantic slave trade had already been operating and expanding for generations. Those men and women stepped onto a shore where tobacco, land hunger, and colonial ambition would fuse with racial slavery to produce a new kind of society, one whose wealth would be inseparable from bondage. But it didn't start with America. The trade began 170 years before the first Africans arrived in Virginia. Portugal was a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, but in the 15th century it made a radical choice. Instead of reaching for empire over land, it pushed into the Atlantic Ocean, funding one voyage after another down the coast of Africa under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator. These expeditions were driven by a potent mix of motives: access to gold and spices, competition with Muslim trade networks, and a belief that expanding Christian power overseas would bring both glory and profit. In 1441, that ambition crossed a moral line that would shape the next 4 centuries. 2 Portuguese explorers, Nuno Tristão and Antão Gonçalves, landed on a stretch of West African coast they labeled Guinea, where they encountered a bustling market run by African Muslim traders. Instead of trading goods, they seized a dozen Africans by force and carried them back across the sea to Portugal, displaying them first as exotic captives for Prince Henry, proof that human beings themselves could be taken, transported, and owned. What began as a single, shocking act of kidnapping quickly hardened into routine. Within less than 2 decades, by around 1460, Portuguese ships were hauling an estimated 700 to 800 Africans into Portugal every year. The random violence of early raids evolved into a system: fortified posts along the coast, agreements with local intermediaries, scheduled voyages, and captives counted and priced like any other cargo, turning human bondage into a standardized business. As profits grew, so did European participation. By the 16th century, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, and Portugal all operated in this expanding Atlantic traffic in African lives, with the Portuguese and Spanish initially controlling much of the trade. Plantations in the Atlantic islands and then across the Americas demanded ever more labor to produce sugar, tobacco, and rice, and slavery was reshaped into an industrial engine. Ships insured, cargoes catalogued, and generations of men, women, and children reduced to entries in ledgers that underwrote Europe's rising wealth. By 1619, this brutal trade had reached the English colonies in North America. In August 1619, at a small English outpost called Point Comfort on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay, a single ship appeared carrying people whose forced arrival would reverberate through American history. Roughly 20-odd Africans were brought ashore at what is now Hampton, Virginia, purchased by hungry colonists in exchange for food and supplies. These men and women had begun their journey thousands of kilometers away in the kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now Angola, a powerful Central African state ruled by an elected king drawn from royal lineages. Captured aboard the Portuguese vessel São João Bautista, and originally destined for the Spanish colony of New Spain, they were seized at sea by English privateers, transferred to English hands, and then sold into a new and uncertain life in Virginia. Crucially, their legal status in these first years did not yet match the lifetime, race-based slavery that would later define the American South. In early Virginia, most Africans were treated under a system closer to indentured servitude, bound to labor for a set number of years, but in principle able to earn release and legal freedom once their term expired. Records suggest that many of those first arrivals had secured their freedom by around 1630, entering a fragile but real space as free black people in a still-forming colony. One of the clearest examples is Anthony Johnson, recorded in the 1620s as an African laborer in Virginia who had arrived a few years after the initial group in 1621. Johnson completed his period of servitude and by 1651 controlled a 250-acre farm on the eastern shore along the Pungateague River, evidence that some early Africans in Virginia not only gained freedom, but also acquired land and property in their own names. In these first decades, the lines between European servants and African laborers were still in flux, their futures not yet locked into a rigid racial caste. This was not slavery as it would later be known. It became slavery. The transformation would take 50 years, and it wasn't inevitable. Most Americans learn that slavery just was, as if it appeared fully formed and inevitable. But the real story is far more unsettling. In the late 1600s, Virginia's ruling class made a series of deliberate choices that turned a fluid, mixed system of labor into a rigid, race-based caste system, and almost no one is ever taught how or why that happened. In 1676, those elites faced a crisis that terrified them to their core. Nathaniel Bacon, a well-connected planter, angry over colonial Indian policy, gathered an army that did not look like the Virginia the rulers wanted. Poor white farmers, white indentured servants, enslaved Africans, and free black people fighting side by side. They marched on the colonial government, burned Jamestown to the ground, and briefly proved that the poorest people in the colony, regardless of color, could unite against those who owned the land and wrote the laws. For Virginia's plantation elite, that multiracial alliance was an existential threat. If poor whites and black people, enslaved and free, could see their common interests, they might overturn the entire plantation order that made a small group rich. After Bacon died and the rebellion collapsed, the question haunting the elite was not just how to restore order, but how to make sure such a coalition never formed again. Their answer was chillingly strategic. Divide the laboring classes by race and bind poor whites to the elite with just enough privilege to feel above black people. Colonial leaders began drawing bright legal lines between white and black, offering poor Europeans new protections and status while locking Africans and their descendants into permanent bondage. Race, in other words, was sharpened and weaponized as a tool of social control, not discovered as a biological truth. This strategy took shape over decades through law. As early as 1640, when an enslaved black man named John Punch ran away with 2 European servants, the court sentenced Punch to servitude for life, while the white men received only extended terms, a clear warning that black and white bodies would be treated differently. In 1662, Virginia decreed that a child's status followed the mother, not the father, meaning any child born to an enslaved woman would be enslaved for life, turning wombs into legal factories of hereditary bondage. In 1667, lawmakers ruled that Christian baptism no longer offered any path to freedom for people of African descent, slamming shut a door that English common law might have left open. By 1705, these and other measures were woven together in a comprehensive slave code that made race-based slavery the foundation of Virginia's social order. Historian Ira Berlin notes that after Bacon's rebellion, authorities increasingly defined people of African descent as hereditary slaves, while extending new rights and opportunities to independent white farmers and landholders. In late 17th century Virginia, freedom and slavery were not opposites growing apart. They were forged together in the same moment, in the same legal documents, granting poor whites land, status, and legal protection precisely as black bondage became permanent and inheritable. Seen through this lens, slavery did not become racial because of ancient hatreds or unchangeable prejudices. It became racial because powerful men needed a firewall between themselves and the possibility of another cross-color uprising. Enslaved Africans and African Americans continued to resist, in open revolt, in everyday acts of defiance, and in the simple insistence on family and community. But the law increasingly stacked the deck against them, while inviting poor whites to see their fate in their skin color instead of their class. Now that slavery was legally established and explicitly race-based, the demand for enslaved labor exploded. Across 4 centuries, the Atlantic Ocean became a vast graveyard. Historians estimate that roughly 10 to 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships bound for the Americas, and at least 2 million of them died during the crossing itself, about 10 to 15% of all those who embarked. Every percentage point in those statistics represents tens of thousands of people who never reached land, whose deaths were calculated into the cost of doing business. On board, captives were jammed below deck into spaces so tight that many could not stand or turn, chained together in darkness, choked with heat and stench. Disease spread rapidly through the packed holds: dysentery, smallpox, measles, scurvy, with filthy conditions, scarce water, and starvation turning the voyage into a slow-motion catastrophe where bodies wasted away beside the living. For many, the psychological shock was as devastating as the physical abuse. Torn from familiar landscapes, surrounded by strangers speaking dozens of different languages, with no idea where they were being taken or whether they would survive the next day. Olaudah Equiano, who endured this journey as a child and later became one of its most important witnesses, described being overwhelmed by the smell and suffocation below deck and believing at first that the Europeans were monsters who meant to kill and eat him. He recalled the screams of chained people, the cries of the dying, the sea he had never seen before, and the moment he realized there was no path back to his home. Memories that haunted him long after he bought his own freedom and joined the fight to end the trade. His survival story embodies a broader truth. Even in the heart of this machinery of death, captives resisted through hunger strikes, suicide attempts, conspiracies, and the sheer act of holding on to memory and identity. Sometimes, the logic of profit made the horror even more explicit. In 1781, aboard the British slave ship Zong, disease and mismanagement threatened to cut into the owner's earnings. The captain and crew decided that sick and weakened captives were worth more dead than alive. So, over the course of several days, they bound and threw 122 Africans into the ocean, later claiming insurance compensation for lost cargo, while people who had watched their relatives dragged to the rail were forced to continue the voyage. The Middle Passage did not just kill, it reshaped identity. Men and women who had set out as Igbo, Fante, Ndongo, and dozens of other nations arrived in the Americas stripped of names, languages, and kin networks, recorded only as part of a numbered shipment of Negroes. In this process, European enslavers collapsed immense cultural diversity into a single invented category: black, using that label to justify permanent bondage and to convince themselves that these captives were a different kind of human, fit for exploitation without limit. Yet even under these conditions, people prayed in whispered languages, shared songs and stories, plotted uprisings, and forged new bonds with strangers chained beside them, quietly insisting that they were more than the racist categories being forced upon them. Those who survived arrived to a world designed to extract maximum labor with minimal humanity. In 1793, a young inventor named Eli Whitney patented a simple machine he thought would reduce the need for enslaved labor: the cotton gin. Instead, it did the opposite. By making it far easier to remove seeds from short-staple cotton, the gin turned cotton into a gold rush crop and locked the American South into an economic model that depended on ever-expanding race-based slavery. Between 1790 and 1860, the enslaved population in the United States soared from roughly 700,000 to nearly 4 million, and cotton became the nation's most valuable export, grown by people who could not claim any share of the wealth they produced. On the ground, this boom translated into lives, measured in fields, lashes, and quotas. Enslaved men, women, and children cleared forests, broke the soil, planted, weeded, and picked from first light until dark, watched by overseers who wielded whips, chains, iron collars, and other instruments of terror to enforce obedience. Those who fell behind, resisted, or were simply unlucky could be beaten until bones broke, branded with an owner's initials, or fitted with metal devices designed to control their bodies and voices. Even at night, there was little safety. Cabins were crowded, food was minimal, and the knowledge that one's children or spouse could be sold at any time hung over every conversation. When Congress banned the international slave trade in 1808, slavery did not shrink. It reorganized. A massive internal traffic in human beings emerged, moving enslaved people from the older tobacco regions of Maryland and Virginia to booming cotton and sugar frontiers in Mississippi, Louisiana, and beyond. Husbands were torn from wives, parents from children, and people spoke of being sold down the river as a death sentence in life, shipped south to harsher climates and even more brutal work. Historians estimate that roughly 1/3 of enslaved children in the Upper South experienced the sale of at least one parent, a trauma that rippled through generations. Yet even in these conditions, enslaved people built worlds of meaning the law could not fully reach. They blended West African spiritual traditions with Christianity, creating a religious culture that promised liberation even when the present seemed hopeless, and sang spirituals whose coded lyrics carried both grief and plans for escape. They forged extended kinship networks that treated friends as family, maintained languages and stories, developed unique cultures such as the Gullah communities of the coastal South, and used naming, marriage, and ritual to insist that they were more than property. Contrary to the myth that enslaved people simply accepted their fate, slavery faced resistance from its victims every single day. Some forms were subtle, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, learning to read in secret, or stealing time for prayer and song. Others exploded into open revolt. In 1739, near the Stono River in South Carolina, an Angolan man known as Jemmy led about 20 enslaved Africans who seized weapons, killed several white colonists, and began marching towards Spanish Florida, where freedom had been promised to fugitives who could reach St. Augustine. As they moved, they gathered more people, swelling to perhaps 60 to 100 marchers calling for liberty before colonial militia overtook them in a battle that left most rebels dead and the survivors executed or sold off to the Caribbean. In response, South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740, sharply tightening control over black life by limiting assembly, movement, education, and self-sufficiency, proof that even failed revolts reshaped the system. In 1822, in Charleston, a free black carpenter named Denmark Vesey organized what authorities later described as a vast conspiracy involving enslaved and free black people up and down the Carolina coast. Using family ties between city and countryside, Vesey and his allies spread plans for a coordinated uprising that could have involved thousands, only to be betrayed before the first blow was struck. Courts executed 35 men and banished many others, but historians note that the real heroism lay in the countless people who refused to inform on their comrades, choosing silence and solidarity despite torture and the threat of death. 9 years later, in 1831, an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner launched what became the deadliest slave revolt in U.S. history. Believing he was called by divine signs, Turner and a small band of followers moved from house to house in Southampton County, Virginia, killing approximately 55 to 60 white men, women, and children in an attempt to shatter the slave-holding order by force. The rebellion was crushed, Turner was captured and executed, and white authorities answered with a wave of retaliatory killings and new laws that further restricted black education, movement, and worship, trying to smother the very capacity to imagine freedom. When the Civil War began in 1861, Abraham Lincoln was not yet the great emancipator of popular memory. His stated priority was preserving the Union, even if that meant leaving slavery untouched where it already existed. He made clear that if he could save the Union without freeing a single enslaved person, or by freeing all of them, he would choose whichever path best held the country together. But as the war dragged on, enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, abolitionist pressure, and the need to weaken the Confederacy pushed Lincoln toward a different course. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in states in rebellion to be free and turning the Union war effort into an explicit struggle against slavery. For many Black Americans, the document was a moment of profound hope, a sign that the federal government was finally aligning, at least on paper, with their centuries-long fight for freedom. The reality, however, was far more limited than the celebration suggested. As a wartime executive order, the proclamation applied only to Confederate states still in active rebellion. It did not touch slavery in loyal border states like Kentucky and Delaware, or in rebel areas already under Union military control, and in places where the Confederacy still held power, it freed no one in practice until Union troops arrived. Legally, it rested on shaky ground, tied to Lincoln's war powers and vulnerable to reversal once peace returned. Lincoln and his allies understood that if slavery were to end everywhere and permanently, the Constitution itself would have to change. In 1864 and 1865, anti-slavery forces in Congress pushed through a new amendment that would strike at the institution directly, not just as a military measure, but as a core principle of U.S. law. On January 31, 1865, the proposed 13th Amendment passed Congress, and by December 6th, the required number of states had ratified it, with formal certification following on December 18th. The language seems simple. Slavery and involuntary servitude were abolished throughout the United States. In legal terms, roughly 4 million enslaved men, women, and children, people whose bodies had been treated as assets on balance sheets, were now recognized as no longer property. For those emerging from bondage, this was an unspeakably powerful moment. Families reuniting, churches and schools forming, and generations who had only known slavery suddenly imagining futures beyond the plantation. Yet buried in the amendment was a crucial loophole. Slavery and involuntary servitude were banned, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In the years that followed, Southern lawmakers seized on that exception, writing black codes and vagrancy laws that criminalized everyday black life, arresting people for minor or fabricated offenses and leasing them out to private employers as convict labor. Coal mines, lumber camps, railroads, and farms across the South became sites of a new form of bondage, slavery by another name, built on the claim that it was all just punishment for crime. By the end of 1865, slavery as a legal institution had been destroyed, but systems that exploited black labor and controlled black bodies were already being rebuilt on the foundation the exception clause provided. Freedom, in other words, had been proclaimed and written into the Constitution. But abolition, the destruction of the structures that made slavery profitable and racial hierarchy normal, was something very different. But freedom and abolition were very different things. For a brief moment after the 13th Amendment, it seemed as if the United States had finally broken with slavery. But almost immediately, Southern lawmakers began crafting new ways to control black labor and black life, proving that the end of legal bondage did not mean the end of exploitation. Across the former Confederacy, states enacted black codes, laws that on paper regulated employment and public order, but in practice were designed to push freed people back into conditions that looked and felt like slavery. These codes required black Americans to sign yearly labor contracts with white employers, criminalized being unemployed or wandering without proof of work, and gave local authorities broad power to arrest anyone who stepped outside those narrow lines. At the heart of these laws were sweeping vagrancy statutes. A black person could be arrested for something as minor as not having written documentation of a job, staying out after dark, or simply standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once convicted, they faced fines they could not pay. The solution, from the state's point of view, was simple: lease them out to private employers until their debt was worked off. This became the convict leasing system, what historians now call slavery by another name. States and counties signed contracts with mining companies, lumber firms, railroad builders, and plantation owners, effectively renting out prisoners to do some of the most dangerous labor in America under almost no oversight. For local governments, black bodies once again generated revenue. For businesses, leasing prisoners was cheaper than hiring free workers. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that between 2,000 and 4,000 African Americans died every year under convict leasing, often at rates higher than during slavery itself, as malnutrition, disease, beatings, and industrial accidents took their toll on people the system regarded as disposable. These deaths were not accidents. They were the predictable outcome of a structure that rewarded officials and corporations for arresting more black people and squeezing as much labor as possible from them before they broke. All of this was possible because of a single phrase in the 13th Amendment. Slavery and involuntary servitude were banned, except as a punishment for crime. That exception turned criminal conviction into a legal trapdoor back into forced labor, allowing states to rebuild a racial caste system under the guise of law and order. From black codes and chain gangs to modern prison labor, the result has been a long, chilling continuity. Mass incarceration as a direct descendant of slavery, justified not by bills of sale, but by court dockets. Violence outside the courtroom reinforced this new order. Between roughly 1865 and 1877, during Reconstruction alone, an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 African Americans were murdered in racial terror lynchings, public killings meant to intimidate entire communities and punish any assertion of black autonomy. Journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett dedicated her life to exposing these crimes, collecting data, interviewing witnesses, and proving that the vast majority of lynching victims were not dangerous criminals, but ordinary people targeted to keep black citizens in their place. By the late 1800s, the promise of emancipation had been overshadowed by a new reality, a lattice of laws, police powers, economic arrangements, and racial terror that recreated many of slavery's functions under new names. By the late 1800s, a comprehensive legal system of segregation had been established. After Reconstruction collapsed, white Southern politicians did not need chains or auction blocks to maintain racial hierarchy. They had the law. Jim Crow statutes rolled out between the 1870s and the mid-20th century, carving racial lines into nearly every corner of public life. Schools, trains and buses, restaurants, hospitals, parks, cemeteries, theaters, restrooms, and even drinking fountains were divided into white and colored spaces by force of statute. Controlling space meant little if black citizens could still use the ballot box, so states moved to shut them out of politics. Between about 1890 and 1910, Southern legislatures rewrote constitutions to impose poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and grandfather clauses that exempted many poor whites while catching almost all black voters in their net, stripping millions of political power without ever mentioning race outright. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court gave this architecture of segregation its constitutional blessing in Plessy v. Ferguson. The justices declared that separating black and white Americans in public facilities was permissible as long as conditions were separate but equal, even though in reality, black schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods received a fraction of the funding and investment given to their white counterparts. Segregation was not only a Southern project. In the early 20th century, as federal housing programs developed, agencies and private lenders increasingly used neighborhood racial composition to decide who could get a mortgage and where, building on a landscape already shaped by racially restrictive covenants that barred black families from buying in many white areas. In the 1930s, the Home Owners Loan Corporation produced color-coded security maps that labeled black and low-income neighborhoods as risky, and subsequent research shows that areas given the worst grades suffered long-term disinvestment, depressed home values, and entrenched segregation. These policies collided with one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history. Between roughly 1910 and 1970, some 5 million African Americans left the rural South in what became known as the Great Migration, heading for cities in the Midwest, Northeast, and West in search of better wages and escape from lynching, sharecropping, and Jim Crow. Yet in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond, they encountered a different kind of color line enforced by real estate steering, redlining, and school district boundaries, producing northern ghettos without the need for explicit segregation laws. Racial terror remained a constant backdrop to this legal and economic order. Between the end of Reconstruction and the mid-20th century, at least 4,400 black men, women, and children were lynched across the United States, often in public spectacles meant to send a message to anyone who challenged white supremacy. Journalists and activists like Ida B. Wells Barnett painstakingly documented these killings, exposing the lie that they were responses to crime and showing instead how often they punished black success, political organizing, or even minor breaches of racial etiquette. And yet, within and against this system, black communities built newspapers, churches, fraternal orders, schools, and civic organizations that refused to accept segregation as normal or permanent. By the 1950s, a generation raised under Jim Crow and hardened by migration, war, and daily struggle, was preparing to mount the most sustained legal and moral challenge the segregation system had ever faced. By the 1950s, the segregation system faced its greatest challenge. In 1954, almost a century after slavery's formal end, a group of black families brought a simple but radical claim to the Supreme Court: that segregated public schools could never be truly equal. In Brown v. Board of Education, the court unanimously agreed, declaring that separate but equal had no place in public education and striking at the legal heart of Jim Crow. On the ground, ordinary people turned that legal victory into a mass movement. In December 1955, after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, black residents organized a city-wide boycott that lasted 381 days, walking, carpooling, and enduring threats and bombings until the Supreme Court forced desegregation of Montgomery's buses, and bringing a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence. Students then carried the struggle into lunch counters. In February 1960, 4 black college freshmen sat down at a whites-only Woolworths counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, politely asked for service, and refused to leave when they were denied. Within weeks, sit-ins had spread across the South, drawing thousands of young people into non-violent direct action and helping birth the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Activists took the fight onto the highways as well. In 1961, interracial teams of freedom riders boarded interstate buses and trains to test Supreme Court rulings that had outlawed segregation in interstate travel, enduring beatings, firebombings, and jail time until federal regulators finally ordered desegregation of bus and train terminals nationwide later that year. Even as violence raged, the movement grew more visible. In August 1963, hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington, D.C., where civil rights, labor, and religious leaders demanded jobs and freedom, and Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his now iconic speech, envisioning a nation that finally lived up to its own promises of equality. The march increased pressure on Congress and the White House to act. That pressure helped produce the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most sweeping civil rights legislation in U.S. history. The law outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations like hotels, restaurants, and theaters, banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and gave the federal government new power to enforce desegregation. But the ballot remained largely out of reach in the Deep South, leading activists to focus on voting rights. In early 1965, organizers in Alabama launched a campaign centered on marches from Selma to Montgomery, and on March 7th, Bloody Sunday, state troopers and possemen brutally attacked peaceful demonstrators on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, shocking television audiences across the country. 2 more marches followed, and by the time thousands finally reached the state capitol, public opinion had shifted decisively toward federal intervention. Later that year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned literacy tests, authorized federal oversight of voter registration, and created a pre-clearance system, forcing jurisdictions with histories of discrimination to get federal approval before changing their voting laws. White officials responded with massive resistance, closing schools, dragging out court cases, and inventing new barriers. But millions of black citizens registered, and voted for the first time, reshaping American democracy. Progress was real, but the struggle was far from over. The victories of the civil rights era changed the law, but they did not end the struggle over how power and punishment would be used in black communities. Beginning in the early 1970s, national leaders shifted from defending segregation to declaring a war on drugs, framing crime and addiction as the new battleground and using criminal justice policy, rather than explicit race laws, to regain control. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced this war on drugs and vastly expanded federal resources for policing and prisons. Years later, his domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman, admitted that the strategy was deliberately designed to tie black Americans to heroin and anti-war activists to marijuana, so that the government could raid their neighborhoods, arrest their leaders, and discredit their movements under the cover of drug enforcement. The next major escalation came in the 1980s. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act created harsh, mandatory minimum sentences and, most notoriously, a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, imposing far longer prison terms for the cheaper form associated with black urban communities than for the more expensive form associated with many white users, even though the drugs are pharmacologically similar. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, black Americans made up only about 13% of the US population, but nearly 40% of people behind bars, and they were imprisoned at roughly 5 times the rate of white Americans. For black boys born in 2001, researchers estimated that about 1 in 5 would experience incarceration in their lifetime. The economic costs of this carceral turn have been staggering and deeply unequal. A criminal record cuts annual earnings by more than half on average, and over a lifetime, those lost wages can exceed $500,000 per person, adding up to at least $370 billion a year in foregone income nationwide. Wealth that is disproportionately stripped from black and Latino families. If you drew this history as a timeline, you would see a grim continuity. Slavery giving way to convict leasing, then to Jim Crow and racialized policing, and finally to mass incarceration, each system updated for a new era, but serving a similar purpose. The same pattern appears outside the prison walls. Redlining and housing discrimination in the 20th century blocked black families from the prime mortgage markets and neighborhoods where white wealth was built, helping create a racial wealth gap in which the typical white family now holds about 10 times the wealth of the typical black family. Those segregated neighborhoods often have underfunded schools, fewer medical facilities, greater exposure to pollution, and higher rates of chronic illness, producing entrenched educational and health disparities that mirror the older geography of exclusion. Put together, the story is not one of isolated injustices, but of a system that keeps reinventing itself. The mechanisms changed, but the function remained the same, maintaining racial hierarchy and extracting labor and resources from black communities. In recent years, a new movement has emerged. In 2013, after George Zimmerman was acquitted in the killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, 3 black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, coined the hashtag Black Lives Matter and began building a decentralized movement focused on anti-black violence and state power. The phrase spread from social media into the streets in 2014, when the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, sparked weeks of protest and made Black Lives Matter a national and then global rallying cry against police brutality and systemic racism. On May 25, 2020, a bystander's phone captured Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, a slow death broadcast to millions and impossible to explain away. Within days, protests erupted in all 50 states. Crowd-counting research and national surveys suggest that between 15 and 26 million people in the United States participated in demonstrations that summer, making the George Floyd uprising very likely the largest protest movement in American history. The names Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others joined a tragic litany of Black lives taken by police or vigilantes, while Black Lives Matter chapters pressed a common set of demands. Real accountability for officers, deep cuts to bloated police budgets, and investment in housing, health, education, and community safety outside of armed law enforcement. In response, some cities and states enacted reforms that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Jurisdictions expanded body camera programs, restricted or banned chokeholds and neck restraints, tightened rules on use of force, and in some cases limited or prohibited no-knock warrants, like the one that led to Breonna Taylor's death. Yet the core numbers have barely moved. For years, police in the United States have killed roughly 1,000 people annually, and detailed databases show that only around 1 to 3% of those killings result in officers being criminally charged, with even fewer convictions. Black Americans remain significantly more likely than white Americans to be killed by police, stopped, searched, and incarcerated, revealing how deeply racial disparities are built into the structures BLM is challenging. Seen against the long arc of history, these contemporary battles are not isolated storms, but the latest phase in a long campaign over whose lives the state protects and whose it controls. From the plantation to the chain gang, from Jim Crow courthouses to red-lined neighborhoods and overcrowded prisons, each era has developed its own tools: slave codes, vagrancy laws, segregation statutes, sentencing policy, aggressive policing, to keep Black communities over-policed, underprotected, and economically drained. The mechanisms changed, but the function remained the same: maintaining racial hierarchy and extracting labor and resources from Black communities. Today's arguments over systemic racism, police funding, reparations, and structural reform are therefore arguments about this entire chain. Slavery from roughly 1619 to 1865, convict leasing from the 1860s into the mid-20th century, Jim Crow segregation from the late 19th century through the 1960s, and mass incarceration and punitive policing from the 1970s to the present. Nearly 400 years after the first Africans arrived in Virginia, the United States still grapples with the legacy of slavery. Understanding this history is not about the past. It's about understanding the present and building a different future.